So we're going to start with an act of worship from the book Worship in the Woods, and I'd love you to join in when we get to that part. One of the sessions talks about us being children of light, but this particular session is about fungi, which obviously live under the ground in the dark a lot of the time, or at least in shadow. And we point out that Psalm 74 says, both day and night belong to you, Lord. You made the starlight and the sun. And that psalm reminds us that although, of course, people can misuse the dark for bad purposes, originally God made nighttime as a good thing. Nighttime is a time when our bodies heal themselves, and the natural world can also grow and heal. It's a time of rest and relaxation and preparation for the next day. And of course, some people are afraid of the dark, but we can know that even if we do feel a bit afraid, that God is always with us, even in those dark places. And in another psalm, it says, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me. Yet even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like day, for darkness is as light to you. So in this particular session, as I say, you're thinking about fungi and thinking about the fact that it lives in dark places and shadowy places. And so in this opening prayer, we're going to say the line together, in the darkest places. Can you say that with me? In the darkest places. Great. And you might want to make an action out of that as well. So maybe put your hand over your eyes as you say that. In the darkest places. Great. And then I'll say a line and then we'll repeat that again. In the darkest places, we need not be afraid. In the darkest places, God's love is still displayed. In the darkest places, things will grow without us knowing. In the darkest places, see God's glory softly glowing. In the darkest places, there is peace and restoration. In the darkest places, there is hope for all creation. In the darkest places, we need not be afraid. In the darkest places, Jesus meets us every day. Amen.
Amen. Thanks. So as an introduction to this session then, we have been worshipping in a local park here in Luton with a small group of families for the past 4 years. So whatever else we say in this session, the basis of the book, Worship in the Woods, is really a bunch of us gathering outside in God's creation, seeing how we can meet with God and talk about the Bible in nature. Now, we are in an important and interesting moment in time as a church, aren't we? Our traditions, our worship styles, the way we organize ourselves have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Habits that we've perhaps never had reason to question before now lay open for examination. Habits like sitting in a row, teaching in a lecturing style, sending children out of the room, or even just choosing to be in that room in the first place. Some of you are here because you're questioning those habits. Many churches haven't met physically in any kind of ordinary way for over a year now. And we know that many church leaders are thinking and praying about what is next. Do we try to, as fast as possible, go back to what church used to look like? Or do we rethink, see if there are other ways of being church together? In the UK, at least, the COVID restrictions are easing and things seem to be going in the right direction here. And yet, some of us and some of our congregations are anxious in this new season. Anxious about seeing people, anxious about being out of the house. And many will feel worried about going indoors suddenly and being with people. And so some of you are here because of a pastoral concern for your people. How can we bring your church together in a way that kind of limits this social anxiety and in a way that can bring wholeness to people? And you will know that even before the pandemic caused anxiety and this kind of upswing in mental health issues that we're all having to battle with, research showed us that being in nature is beneficial for our mental health. Various studies through the last 10 to 15 years have shown that being exposed to a natural environment helps reduce stress, mood disorders, and depression. They found that calming nature sounds lowers blood pressure and lowers the level of the stress hormone cortisol. They found that attention deficit disorder and aggression lessen when people are in a natural environment. And even the physical healing of the body is sped up in an outdoor environment. This kind of sounds like the medication for our time, I think. So whether you come today wanting to try something new just for your church, or think of ways to changing how you worship as a church, or if you're searching for a way that will enable you to work together with the Holy Spirit to bring wholeness and healing to your people, you are really welcome. The opportunity to try something new and the benefits of nature is of course not our only reasons, or our main reasons even, for worshipping outdoors. So I want to just give you the key reasons that we see and which we list in the introduction of the book as well. Firstly, when we're outside, we get a first-hand experience of God's creativity, of God's character and his personality. The Creator's fingerprints are all around us, and we get to marvel at the way the natural environment functions, the tiny things and the huge things. And as a Christian, I kind of carry this suspicion that this is one of the reasons why people feel so much better in their souls when they're outside. They're simply one step closer to the God, the Creator, who loves them. And secondly, if we want to learn from God's word, we'll find it easier to step into the story when we're outside. Most of Scripture happened outside, and it's frankly a little bit weird that we tend to stand on well-lit platforms indoors and talk about things like the parable of the sower, the river of life in Revelation, or Moses' burning bush. Because we could be outside and get a sense of that story in real multisensory ways. Thirdly, one of the findings in this kind of newish field of eco-psychology that I was sort of quoting some research from is that the natural environment is extra beneficial, and so I would say extra important for children. The enormous rise in forest schools and kind of forest school activities is a witness to this, I think. But I personally don't feel like I need research to tell me that when my kids were smaller, it was much easier to meet a friend in the park than have a play date at home. Imagination, sharing, calm creativity, we all function better outside. And perhaps you have the same experience. And now when our kids are older and kind of getting into the teenage years, being able to go out and experience different natural environments, woods, hills, riversides, really have been lifesavers for us during the pandemic. It's something we can enjoy together, and together even with the grandparent generation, and be united around as a family. So being outdoors is a unique intergenerational thing. Fourthly, when we meet to worship Jesus outdoors, we blur lots of boundaries which have been needed to be blurred for a long time. Boundaries like the ones between newcomers and long-term church members, between things we think of as sacred, church, liturgy, meetings in church, and things we think of as secular, exercise, giggles, the physical world around us. God and the Bible don't have this sacred secular divide. It also blurs the boundaries between ages and levels of expertise. Not just the professionals get to have an opinion about what the clouds look like today, for example. And fifthly, and finally, worshipping God and exploring faith outside helps us to make the connection with the stewardship command God gave humanity back in Genesis. If we never go outside, if we never pray outside, if we don't get to know the creatures and the plants outside, we won't notice the climate emergency that is at our door. And the church really ought to be in the forefront of protecting creation, but sometimes we're pretty good at going inside and shutting the door on the world that God so loves. So those are some of our reasons for why we want to go outside and worship. and we're going to get to the how-tos. But I wanted just to show you a really simple gathering worship idea that we have in this book. And this is from the session about roots. And we are doing an action poem as a gathering activity that is based on Paul's really famous prayer in Ephesians 3. Could you be my book holder? Mm-hmm. So this has got some actions. So when I read it, you don't need to read it, you don't need to say it, but your way of joining in will be to join in the action that I do. Are you ready? No love is wider. Can you do your arms really wide? No love is longer. Can you make a long shape? So root us, God. Try and find some floor to stamp on. In the love of Jesus. Can you make a heart? Great. No love is higher. How high can you stretch? No love is deeper. Maybe you can touch the floor. So root us, God. Have a stamp on the ground. In the love of Jesus. Amen. So we have Jeremy on the call, Jeremy Williams, who can maybe tell us who he is and what he does. We've asked him to share some thoughts on how to spark ideas from the natural environment we find ourselves in.
Hello, thank you. Yes, my name is Jeremy Williams, and I'm a writer on social and environmental issues, and I help to lead Park Church along with Sarah and Sam. And I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about how we generate ideas from nature. Because one of the things that we often hear, and that's a real obstacle to outdoor church, is that not everyone feels confident talking about nature. And so I wanted to say at this point that you really don't need to be an expert ecologist in order to lead outdoor worship. And I remember going on walks with my grandparents, and they would be able to name dozens of different wildflowers or hedgerow plants and so on. And you might know people who can recognize all the different birds by their bird song, or who can identify, one little black beetle from any other kind of little black beetle and know the difference between them. And if you have one of those people in your community, then that's fantastic. Or if you are one of those people yourself. We don't have one of those people in Park Church, and it hasn't stopped us. Ideally, when it comes to Park Church and what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn together. So one of the first things to say is that you don't magically get to know all this stuff about trees and birds and plants and whatever. You have to be taught it. And most of us have never been taught that stuff. It doesn't come up in school. Unless you make a really deliberate effort to go and learn these things, you won't know them. And so I don't think any of us need to be embarrassed that we don't know the names of all the trees or the names of all the birds and so on. But we are interested in learning more about them, and we're going to do that together. And certainly in Park Church, if you find that somebody does seem to have all the answers, it's probably only because they've Googled it the night before while they were preparing the session. But I want to look at some really practical ways of generating ideas from nature and learning from nature, especially if we're not hugely experienced in that kind of stuff. And the first one to say is spend time in the place where you meet, just observing. And I know there's going to be a really big range of locations represented on the call today. There's going to be people who have got nature reserves or perhaps national parks, big forests. We might also have some churchyards or local parks. Some people might be lucky enough to be able to do outdoor worship on the beach, which I kind of envy a little bit. But the main thing about all these different things is whatever you've got, it's worth popping down there every once in a while just to observe. And I only do this a couple of times a year, to be honest, myself. But it often gives me a dozen different ideas of things I can work up into different sessions for Park Church. And I'll just go down to the park where we meet with a notebook and wander around and just have a look at what's going on and take notes, what seasonal changes are happening, what's new, what's moving, what catches my eye, if there's any new color popping up from the ground in different places. And I'll make notes, and then I'll go away and I'll look those things up later. And to give an example, one time I was doing this and I noticed fairy rings on the big sloping patch of grass that we have. And you get those those strange circles of darker grass. And I hadn't seen them before in that place. So I went away, looked them up, read up on them, and that became the basis for a really fun park church session that we did. The second recommendation is to find your experts. So if you do know anyone who is really good on nature and who knows loads about it, then borrow them for an hour and take them for a walk around the place where you meet, because they'll spot loads of different things and point them out to you. And again, just make lots of notes and you can come back to those things later. They might spot things that are unusual, which you might not necessarily know about. You wouldn't know if they were rare. I've had the opportunity to do this in our park with the council's conservation officer. And they pointed out, for example, a group of elm trees that we have in the park. And you could walk past these 100 times and not really notice anything about them. But they were really proud of them because most elm trees were wiped out in the 70s and 80s by Dutch elm disease. And so the fact that they still had this stand of them there in the park, they were really proud of that. And we haven't done anything about that yet, but one day we'll come back and we'll do a session on the elm trees that are kind of constantly dying and coming back again in this little patch. And we also learned that we have a chalk hillside, and that's quite unusual. And so there are all these different wildflowers that thrive in chalky land that don't thrive in other places. And we also learned some history. So if you've got a local historian who can walk around your patch with you, that could be really interesting too. We learned that we've got evidence of hillside ice age farming, for example, in our park, which is quite cool. If you don't know someone you could ask to go for a walk with you, then ask around. There's almost certainly someone in the church who knows about this stuff or who has an interest in birds or plants or weather, whatever it might be. And if you can't find an expert, then take a walk with a toddler, because they will force you to slow right down and you will notice things with them that you wouldn't notice otherwise. Number 3 is to read some books. So if we're serious about the idea that creation is alive with the knowledge of God, then when we're learning about the natural world, that's a really good way to inspire our faith. So picking up a good book of nature writing can be really helpful in inspiring outdoor worship. There's books that are quite well known, like the Cloud Spotter's Guide, that will give you information, or there's one called The Secret Life of Trees or The Hidden Life of Trees. I'm reading this one at the moment, The Heartbeat of Trees, which is really interesting. If you don't want to read a whole book about one topic, there are lots of really good books that have insights from all sorts of different aspects of nature. Like, for example, this one by Chris Packham and Megan McCubbin, Back to Nature, which was written off the back of the interest in nature that was seen during lockdown. Or also this one, Lucy Jones's Finding Eden. No, Losing Eden, in fact. My daughter's called Eden. She doesn't like this book. She gets very suspicious when I read it. So yeah, picking up some of those books, seeing what you learn, take some notes. And then finally, I'd suggest signing up to emails from the RSPB, from the Wildlife Trusts, from people like that, because there are people whose job it is to help people engage with nature. And those emails are full of useful tips, and particularly things to see at different times of the year. So they're very seasonal. And just signing up to those, whether you've got local charities or whatever it is you're interested in, it could be bats or bug life or birds or whatever it is, sign up to those, and there's lots of good information in there for you. I think that's all I wanted to say, really, those 4 things, and I'll hand back to Sam and Sarah.
Great, thank you. I hope that was helpful for you guys. So we've had some other feedback. Sharon has 9 churchyards. You should be able to find lots of different kind of nature bits in there. And another Sharon agrees with the little people getting a different point of view. I agree with that too. And yeah, poetry books are good. Yes, there are some fabulous children's picture and storybooks that can inspire Forest Church. Totally right. That's great. Nature almanacs to signpost you through the seasons. That's great. See, you're on this. So I just wanted to share some really getting a little bit more practical of how to, if you want to do church or worship outside. The first thing to say is that there is no one size fits all. A group that is mostly made up of families with toddlers or preschool kids will have very different needs to a group made up mostly of retired folks, for example. I do believe that nature is great and beneficial for all different groups of ages, but you just need to think through what kind of group of people you have and what it needs to look like for them. Think about what your group needs to make them feel happy and safe. And if this is going to be a strange thing for some people, then you maybe want to provide some little life jackets for them as you start. So that might mean spelling out really clearly things like where you're meeting, how long it's going to be, what clothing you recommend. Some people won't put a raincoat on unless they've been told to. Whether people need to bring a chair, whether there'll be somewhere to sit. If you're not going to be in the churchyard, maybe make sure you're somewhere where there's a toilet and let people know there's going to be a toilet. Another life jackets might be putting something in your session that makes people feel safe, something that they recognize. So perhaps for some of you, you start your service every week in a particular way. Maybe you could do that in a simple way outside and then move on to more nature-based activities. Or maybe you always say the Lord's Prayer together. Maybe that's something you can do at the end of the session, just to make people know that this is still church and we're still together in the same way, even though I don't recognize all of it. So think about whatever you need to do for your group practically, but also to make them feel safe and at home and part of the group. Having said all that, try to not take the inside out, but go to your environment where you're going to be meeting and see what springs naturally from here. What is the natural way of worshiping God at this point? If you feel like bringing a screen outside or setting up a PA system or running the full liturgy of your ordinary service, you may need to rethink. Outdoor worship has different values in our minds. And when you do something like set up a sound system outside, you are still doing that thing of dividing the congregation into those who listen and those who are privileged to speak. Could you take this opportunity to try something different, where everyone is heard, where everyone's on equal level? A new environment will make it easier to try new ways of worshipping and different acts of worship. So for us, for example, in terms of Bible teaching, we find that a discursive way of communicating with a mix of discussion and games work much better than someone telling the group. We find the smaller groups are much easier than big groups, which is just as well at the moment. And singing can be fine and it can work, especially things like simple rounds or call and response songs, that kind of thing. But we tend to fall to doing things like the action prayers that we've shown you, praise shouts, or just kind of simple reflections as a group. That seems to be the more indigenous worship styles where we meet. And finally then, if you're an official church doing this, you need to make sure you have all your fun policies in order. You'll need to think through the various scenarios and make sure that you're covered for these. Check that you have things like public liability insurance that covers what you're planning to do. So that's something you can check with your insurer. Someone emailed and asked that earlier, but do check with your insurance what you're covered for. And I know that if you're going to go outside and do things, in order for your insurance to cover that, you often have to do a risk assessment. But that's really sensible anyways, isn't it? To think through what is the risks, what are the risks as we go out here, where can people disappear or hurt themselves. Make sure you work really closely with the safeguarding lead in your church. And if your safeguarding policy or your health and safety policy doesn't cover scenarios outside, then you might need to just add that to your policy or even create a new one, a kind of safeguarding outside policy or whatever. Policies sound really boring, but they are really helpful tools just to make sure you've thought everything through. I know we've had times when, and I can't say this word, an unaccompanied child has turned up and said, "Can I join your session?" If you haven't thought through, what your policy is or what's the safest way to handle that, then you can get a bit muddled up. At that point, for us, we were doing an open community session rather than a kind of park church worship session. So we had consent slips that we could get the kids to get a signature. But yeah, definitely ask your safeguarding lead. And if your safeguarding lead in your church doesn't know, then ask them to kind of research it. The old CCPAS 31.8, they will probably be able to have ideas or things like safeguarding leads for different denominations. Sam is busy typing answers. Is there anything we need to cover out loud?
Someone else has to define the size of a small group. I think we imagine somewhere between about 12 and 25 for the kind of resources that we've put out. I think if it was bigger than that, you're either going to have to scale it up in terms of really thinking through how am I going to work with this larger group, or simply split into sort of smaller subgroups. We feel the dynamic of outdoor worship and park church and things works better when you can be discursive, when you can do activities together, when you're more in a round. And so that would be the reason for doing it like that. And that would be the sort of numbers, sort of 12 to 25. Yeah.
Great. Should we save the other questions?
Yeah.
What are you making note of?
Yeah.
Some of the good questions. Great. We didn't have time for this one in the last session, but we have time for it now. So I'd really want to do this active confession prayer with you before we continue. So this is another active session. This is actually from the light session, not from the dark session, but it's got to do with light and dark. And it's a confession prayer that falls in the response section of the worship time. So we've talked a lot about how trees turn towards the light to grow, and the mechanics of how that works. So the explanation goes, we're going to respond to God using a prayer with actions. So I want you to look around you and see where your greatest source of light is coming from. Some of you are sitting by a window. If you're outside, find where the sun is. I have a window on my left, so I'm going to treat that as my source of light. So I want you to turn away from your source of light for a moment. We're going to pray. God, we are sorry when we turn away from you. Sometimes it's because we're selfish. Sometimes it's because we're stressed. But right now, in the silence, we confess the moments when we've turned away from you. And then let's turn back to the source of light. We repent, God. We turn back and aim to direct ourselves towards you. Thank you for your forgiveness in Christ. And then let's cover our eyes with our hands. Sometimes we find ourselves in the dark, God. Obstacles, depression, or confusion descend on us. It can be a scary time, but we thank you that Psalm 23 says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Thank you for your presence with us in the dark places. May we be like the plants that grow the most in these times and reach for you with all our might. And let's remove our hands. God, your love is amazing, blinding, and stunning. We wait in your presence now. Oh man, at that point, I would wait in the presence until someone started chatting or giggling or hopping around. Right, Sam is going to talk about the resource.
Okay, so someone was asking, what's the book? It's Worship in the Woods. It's our new book of 10 sessions of outdoor worship. And I'm just going to explain a little bit of the practicalities of using this book. First thing I would say is do read through the whole book when you get it, so you've got an overview. And you can just do it from front to back, or you can pick and choose around the sessions. It may be that you think, oh, okay, this particular session will work for my group the best. So it may be that you meet by a river or a pond, and so, or someone said the beach. So it might be that the water session, which I think is session 9, that might be the best place to start. Or it might also be to do with the time of year. This is another great thing about outdoor worship is when you're indoors, the seasons don't really change, do they? You don't really notice a lot of difference. You take your coat off, the central heating's on, it's pretty much the same. But when you're outdoors, every week your natural environment changes. The colours start to change, the wind picks up, or it gets warmer, or it gets colder. All these things are all part of the richness of meeting outdoors. So it might be that as you come towards autumn, you think, the leaves session, that's going to work really well today because the seasons are changing, and we can talk about seasons and the colours of the leaves and things. Now, I do want to say as well that not all churches will run these activities or these sessions in the same way. So think about your own church. Are you expecting everyone in your church to come? Are you essentially sort of replacing Sunday morning with an outdoor meeting? Or is it going to be a smaller group? Are you going to do it for a particular amount of families or particular people who are interested? Maybe it'd be on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon or something like that. Are you aiming it as a missional thing? Are you aiming to attract people who wouldn't normally come to your the thing that you do indoors? That's another consideration. Or are you aiming it at families or older people? I know people often will think this is a good thing to do with children's groups, and we totally agree. Children love this kind of stuff in the main. But we would say, do consider that this is a great intergenerational thing. So can you perhaps bring in other generations? And even if you're doing it with the children's group, perhaps there are other people who would really love to be part of that. And do think about how this fits in with your overall church's kind of vision and values. How does it sit alongside the other things you're doing? You obviously don't want this to compete. You obviously don't want to give the impression that you're critiquing something else that's going on. So put it in positive terms. This is a fresh thing, a different opportunity, meet with God in an outdoor space. And yeah, just point out how it's going to complement the other things that are going on in your fellowship. Now, when you are using the sessions, don't feel like you have to do all the activities within one session. With anything we put out, with any kind of resource, we always want to encourage you to adapt it for your context, because you know who's there, you know what the kind of ages, stages, you know things like if there are people with particular abilities or educational needs, things like that. So you need to tailor it to your own group. And for example, as Sarah's already mentioned, we have a number of young children in our Park Church group. So we tend to do a lot of active things. You can't sit and talk to them for half an hour. You have to get them do it. You maybe do 5 minutes on something and then, right, we're up and we're doing a nature activity. Or if we're doing a Bible story, we're normally acting it out, or we're having a quiz, or we're moving around the park, the wood space. So that is particularly for us very important. But it may be that your group has got a lot of older people, or just a lot of people who are more reflective and a little bit slower. Maybe people are asking about, do you need to stand up all the time? Well, no, not if that's not good for your group. We certainly sit on blankets or sit on logs quite a lot of the time. But you're just going to have to be aware of that with the group that you've got. Someone's asking, how long is a session? Our Park Church sessions, I would say, normally tend to be between about 40 minutes to an hour, maybe a bit longer if we're doing it.
Depends on how warm it is outside.
Yeah, how warm it is outside. It might stretch out into a lunch or a picnic or something, or if we're really getting into something. But I would have thought probably about 40 minutes to an hour is about average for us.
And the children will be very disappointed if they're not allowed to play about at the end.
Yeah. And yeah, think about the size of your group. As I said before, we tend to think about between about sort of 12 to 25, something like that. And if you're expecting more than that, will you split those people into smaller groups? Maybe you'll just create one simple crib sheet that each group could take away and know, right, this is what we're going to do. Or maybe you would prep some leaders for each group. That kind of thing, if you're thinking about being bigger than that. We have found this kind of thing for us doesn't really work to get 50, 80 people on a field and a megaphone and shout at them. Suddenly the dynamic is so different. You've got a leader then and an audience, whereas we're looking for something in the round, we're looking for something discursive, active. Everyone can equally chip in, have an opinion, have a view. that's the dynamic that we're looking for, and I would encourage you to at least explore that. You may do something gathered at the end. I can imagine a situation where, say you're in quite a large church, you might do 5 minutes or 10 minutes of gathered time at the beginning, and then say, right, everyone's got a sheet, let's go off and do the activities. That kind of thing could work really well. And also work out what you need to take along with you beforehand, obviously. And that's, again, going to involve reading through the activities. A lot of the time, it's pretty much reliant on what is around you. So go and pick a leaf up off the floor, or look at the sky, or look at a tree, or do something with dirt, or find an insect, or whatever. And it's kind of that kind of thing. But there are a few things where we've said you might want to take along. So there's something about seeds, and we've said if there's not going to be a lot of seeds around at that time of year, you may want to, you know, when you're cutting up your fruit during the week, just save a load of seeds and take them with you to the meeting. There are some things as well, like it's a really fun nature activity that we did in Park Church around a water filter. Hopefully you can see that. And so we had everyone making water filters out of old bottles, and you can see the photos there of everyone kind of really getting into that activity.
Excellent presentation skills.
Thank you. But obviously, you can't just decide that on the morning. Oh, we'll all make water filters, especially if you've got multiple groups. So again, this is just something where you need to think a little bit ahead, take enough, be prepared. You know, we cut the bottles before we went out, things like that. Yeah, so just think about what you need to take. And if occasionally we suggest people doing things on sheets, we don't do that all the time, to be honest, because again, it feels a little bit like indoor church to have a worksheet every week. But occasionally, so there's a really nice activity here around tree rings and thinking about your life in terms of tree rings and what has God done in your life as you've grown, in the same way that you can see the life of a tree in its rings. So there's a sheet for that. Again, you need to, those are free. There's a link in the book. You just go and print those out for as many people as you want. Or also we put all the Bible readings on sheets that, again, you can print out, or you can send to people's phones. So it might be that everyone's on a WhatsApp group and everyone's got the Bible readings on their phone. And then that's an easy way of doing those together. And again, the aim of that is simply that we want more voices to be heard. So if you can distribute the Bible readings, it means that you'll hear more voices. Yes, I think that's it.
Great. Cool. So we've got some time for questions and answers. I've been noting down some things. The book is unavailable everywhere. It's only available on engageworship.org/store. Yeah?
That's right.
So it will definitely be available at Engage Worship. You've addressed, do we stand? Yeah, we sit on blankets.
We sit on blankets, we sit on logs. I can imagine with older people, you might ask them to bring a fold-out chair. It's obviously different, you know, if you're in the churchyard, that's going to be different to up a mountain somewhere. So it's contextual, but don't, you know, the whole question of abilities, you know, people often ask things like, what if people can't see? What if people can't walk? There's always going to be these kind of things. And really, that's a contextual question for you to answer, knowing the people that you've got coming to your event.
Yeah. Should we talk about the council?
Yeah.
So it's a question of, when do we need permission from the council to meet in a public park, and you know, what kind of license do we need? Our recommendation is check with your council. Hope that doesn't feel like a cop-out, but each area will have different rules probably, and if you make friends with the people at your council and chat to people, I'm sure they're really happy to help. We have never applied for any kind of permission for our kind of weekly Park Church meetings, because we're really only, you know, a couple of groups of 6 meeting and talking, and I don't think the council will be that interested. But when we have done big public events, so we've done an Easter trail a couple of times, we've done a what else have we done?
Autumn torchlight welly walk.
We did do that, but I don't think that was a. Anyways, it's very blurry. Jeremy,
we've done big summer picnics.
Oh yeah, we did a big picnic.
Yeah, those kind of things. When you're going to make quite a significant impact on the park, when you're going to advertise it widely, then we have gone through the park and done all their forms and their risk assessments and stuff.
I do think that it's to do with your advertising. So if you're inviting everyone in the community, then I think you should probably contact the council. And so when we've done that, in Luton, we had to find within the leisure and culture section, there was a events page, and you can download a form. And yeah, Jeremy's wife Lou has very kindly done this for us each time, but I've spoken to her, and so she got a form, you had to fill it in, and normally it would involve letting them know that you have public liability insurance as a church or as an organisation, and you have to show that you've done a risk assessment, and normally you have to make sure that you have a couple of qualified first aiders. And as I was kind of writing that down, I realized it's probably not that different from what churches need to have to meet indoors, right? You all need public liability and safeguarding and first aiders and stuff like that anyways. But yeah, just doing a risk assessment, I guess, and going through the application. But yeah, and I guess start in time if you're planning to do that, because it can take a little while.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm in the middle of a Zoom work meeting, so
anything else on the council thing, Jeremy? Did I miss anything? No. Okay. Yeah, the prayers are from the book. Someone asked, Park Church suggests you always meet in the same place. Is that preferable?
That's a good question for Jeremy.
Oh yeah.
What do you think about that, Jeremy?
We do have a particular spot where there's a group of logs that kind of make a circle. And so that's our default place to meet. But we can move around a little bit. If it's really sunny in winter, then we'll meet at a park bench right in the full sun rather than meeting under the trees. Sometimes we'll meet down on the flat bit and move up the hill. And sometimes moving around the park is part of the session. We'll do sessions that we did one on Exodus, for example, where we moved from place to place. We did one at Christmas time, which was themed around following the star, and we had a big star-shaped helium balloon, and we followed that around the park. So we move around, we make full use of the space. And again, this is one of those things where if you go and spend time in the space and you work out all the different environments that you've got, the different plants, you'll find all sorts of different things you can use. You know, where are the sunny places, where are the shady places, where is there water, where are there different kind of animals, bits of trees, bits of grassland, whatever you've got, you can use it all. And WhatsApp is quite a useful way to keep people up to date on where you're meeting that time. It's also useful to have a default place that kind of feels like home that you can meet back at.
I mean, I've had people do things like going on a sort of ramble, you know, a monthly ramble with a kind of spiritual sort of theme, and they would go on a different route each time. So again, there's no one way of doing it. For us, it has worked having a sort of base that we then roam around, but I could see you doing it in different ways as well.
Yeah, it really depends on if you're an indoor church that are wanting to do outdoors occasionally, then I suspect you can meet in different places, you know, especially if you want to do a session on water and a session on the forest, and you know, you're very rarely going to find all of that in one place. I think for us, our group almost sees the park as our little parish and our little bit that we care about, so that's why we tend to stick to the same place. There is no advice on risk assessments in our book. You're asking the wrong people. There's plenty of advice on risk assessment, I'm sure. Last week we had some I had some links from the Eden Community Project. I'm just going to say this out loud. Maybe you can type as I say it. The Eden Community Project, they organised this great event called the Big Lunch, which we're about to help with in our park later on this year. And on their website for how to organise the Big Lunch, there's a page called the Legal Nuts and Bolts, which was quite helpful. It had lots of little different things to think about if you organise a community event outside. I found that helpful. So you might be able to, right, so what do you do about the weather? Well, we sacrifice a goat and then the sun always shines. No, we don't do that. So I'm from Sweden, and in Sweden, we have a saying that goes, there are no bad weathers, there are only bad clothing, which rhymes in Swedish. And that's probably why, you know, no one knows it in England. And so we just try and dress well. We have once we faffed around with a tarpauling and attached it to fences and sounded that. And, you know, to be honest, the kids loved that. They thought that was the best thing ever. So we should probably do that again. But normally we just wear waterproofs and wellies and cope with the weather. There has been the odd occasion. We cancelled a outdoor carol singing when people blew away because it was like an actual storm. But otherwise we don't tend to cancel.
Somebody asked about Eucharist, communion. We have been based out of a Baptist church, so we're fairly informal about these things. Obviously, it will depend on your denomination to some degree, how happy you are to do that outside and how you want to frame that.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, keep going up.
Okay.
Any other comments you want to make while I'm talking?
Sorry.
Someone suggested doing a Celtic Eucharist, which sounds great. I can imagine that would work really well. We ourselves, we've done some stuff where we've talked around things like Jesus saying, "I'm the bread of life." Jeremy's brought his little rocket stove and we've actually cooked flatbreads on the, again, risk assessment, but we've done that kind of thing. You could crush grapes to make grape juice if you wanted to. Again, this will depend on, you know, what your kind of rubrics are for doing Holy Communion, but we've done all those kinds of things. I mean, to me, it's something that works really well in that kind of setting of being more in the round, being outside. So many connections to nature. So there's huge amounts of potential there. We haven't done it super regularly because someone asked about how often do we meet. We've tended to meet every other week. And in the week between that, we've been going back to our kind of sending church. So we've tended to go back to the sending church, but it's something I think you certainly could do.
David and Trish Tazzini Lloyd, excellent. They've provided an activity risk assessment doc. Download it before it disappears. That's amazing. See, that's what Engage is so great. It's full of people like you who just share your knowledge. We appreciate that. Have you seen your group grow? And that's an interesting question. We've seen people come and go. Like everyone else, we've had a year of pandemic. I think I was surprised because I thought surely absolutely everybody wants to go and worship outside. Turns out that people like outside when it's sunny and not really when it's rainy. So I thought it would be an amazing kind of church growth model, but it hasn't been, and it has actually been, you know, it's been nice being small as well. I think we're in an opportunity right now, as I said in the beginning, where people are thinking and wondering, and especially I know most of my friends who have families have not been to physical church. Even where churches have opened up, it's mostly, you know, you're not wanting to do that with your kids. So for people who are thinking about how can I start going back to church with my children, and especially families who have not kept up at all with any kind of prayers or online church or anything like that, I think outdoor worship could be a great kind of step back into talking about faith, being together as a community. So this is why we put out this book now, because I think this is the moment where everyone's going to love this. Nicola says, you say sending church, do you see your wood park gathering like a church plant then? That was the initial reason why we started. I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to talk about that? I'm tired of my voice.
Yes, so I'm part of a church, Stopsey Baptist Church, which had a vision to send out smaller groups to meet in different contexts around the town. And so we were one of those. They call them beacon groups. And so we are in a way kind of planted into the park, but because we're doing things every other week, we can go back to the church in between. Just to say a little bit more about the the weather and those sorts of things as well. What we've realized is that there is so much more interest in the summer. It kind of comes in the spring, through the summer, and by autumn, you've got people who perhaps just part of your family culture or your personal preferences, you're not really up for standing around in the rain doing outdoor worship. And then it tends to default back to the few core families that are really part of it. And so that's fine. Rather than trying to convince people that they need to do that stuff, we have been more recently trying to plan, and the pandemic ruined this, but we were planning a series of monthly events that were slightly bigger, had a wider welcome, worked for bigger groups, and we would just run those for the summer months. So that's another way of looking at that as well.
There is a thing to respond to someone talk about messy church. I know there is a thing called Mossy Church that has a Facebook group at least, and I think it's connected possibly with Forest Church. So they might have some ideas and resources.
I do think there's quite a few people who are trying outdoor activities with as part of their messy church. There's also Muddy Church, says Joe and Louise Brown. Yeah, that's great. There's a question about whether we have a trailer or a short video clip. No, we don't. Not yet. Anyways, I guess you're studying online, are you? Otherwise, you could just bring in a flower and give it to them and say, "Look, smell this." Any other questions? Has everything been answered? In which case we might do a sending prayer. If there's information in the chat that you want to keep, just make sure you copy and keep that. When will you start to meet again? Do you mean in terms of pandemic? We have actually, Park Church is pretty much the only thing we have done for this last year as a group of people. Some of it has been doing activities as families at home and then having a Zoom chat about that. But we're actually trying to meet every week at the moment before kind of the big churches open up, because it's been really helpful for our kids, basically.
So we wanted to say, when you start doing these things, we would love to hear about it.
Oh, yeah.
And if you've got photographs, obviously with all the permissions that you need, or not showing faces or whatever, but we'd love to see any photographs, and you can put those on our Engage Worship Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, or you can email them to us, or you can just send us stories. But we'd love to know feedback of people doing this. That'd be really encouraging and helpful for us. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'll say this closing prayer. Oh, do check out as well. We don't have time to post it, but we do have a lovely little video. There's a song that you'll see in one of the weeks about colours, and it's written by a family. They kind of wrote it together, and it's very interactive. So you sing, "We're amazed by the blue," and then you encourage people to say a blue thing. So say, you know, blue sky, yeah, blue whale, whatever it is. And we're grateful for the white polar bears, or whatever it is. It's really fun. And Sarah and I have some new colleagues in Engage Worship, and they made the recording and made a lovely little video. So that is, again, we don't do a lot of singing outside, but that's been a bit of a hit with our Park Church folks. So it's worth giving that a go. Okay, so this is our final sending prayer, and it's very much like the one I did at the beginning, but your phrase that you need to say with me is "Scatter us, God." Should we try it together? Scatter us, God. And you can do that with also doing a scattering motion, or however you like to scatter things. Scattering seeds, that's the idea. So ready? Scatter us, God, to our homes, schools and workplaces. Scatter us, God, tiny seeds that grow with your care. Scatter us, God, to share love, truth and encouragement. Scatter us, God, that your word may bear fruit in your world. Scatter us, God, to serve you through our week. Scatter us, God, and gather us back next week with stories of your faithfulness.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, guys. Lovely to see your faces, and hopefully we'll hear how you get on.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bless you. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you.